Welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. You might be interested to know that we don't just produce this fortnightly podcast on military history, but we have a stable of other podcasts as well, which might pique your interest. Angus produces his own podcast looking solely at World War II, which you can find at www.2podcast.com. His latest episodes have covered various topics such as MacArthur, a Stug 3 restoration at the Yorkshire Wartime Experience, and military internees in the Irish Free State. And there is a whole panoply of other subjects to keep your ears occupied, so do go and take a look and listen at www.2podcast.com. We also produce the regular podcast for Ancient Warfare magazine. The Ancient Warfare magazine podcast takes the form of a video panel discussing a subject in more detail from the latest edition of Ancient Warfare magazine. Angus often hosts and is joined by contributors and writers for the magazine, as well as others from time to time, to delve into the given subject with detail. You can find out more by going to ancient-warfare.com, or if you like our Facebook page, which we'd love you to do, you'll see when we're about to record an Ancient Warfare magazine podcast, and you can ask your own questions which you'd like to be answered. And the newest to our family of podcasts is the War Games, Soldiers and Strategy podcast, where we look at all things in miniature, scaled and modelled, among other things. One of the latest episodes looks at the production of the little men we create into armies. And joining in the discussion in that episode is Leon from Pendraken Miniatures and Julian from Victrix Limited. Again, just like our Facebook page, facebook.com/The History Network, or go along to our website, www.thehistorynetwork.org, to find out more. And indeed, it's at our website that you'll find the store where we sell previous seasons of our podcasts for just £2 each. These each come as chaptered files for download, and each season lasts anywhere up to around 5 hours, so you've plenty to be listening to there. We hope to see you around the site or on Facebook, and you can drop us a line anytime by writing to info@thehistorynetwork.org. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 21, Episode 4, The Battle of Franklin. This episode was written by Thomas Hall. A US citizen, Tom holds a degree in history from Cornell College and a law degree from the University of Wisconsin. He is co-author of a number of references regarding technology law, but his heart remains in history. As a military historian, he refers to himself as an armchair field marshal. A former resident of Franklin, Tennessee, he roomed in one of the homes pressed into service as a field hospital. Indeed, local tradition holds that Confederate General States' Rights Gist died in his former bedroom. As night fell on July the 4th, 1863, the fate of the Confederate States of America had been sealed. General Robert E. Lee's second attempt to invade the Union had been turned back at Gettysburg with heavy and irreplaceable losses. In the west, the city of Vicksburg surrendered to Ulysses Grant, severing the eastern and western portions of the Confederacy and denying the Confederates use of the Mississippi River. The Confederacy would fight the remainder of the war on the defensive, with steadily dwindling resources. These facts were doubtless unknown to Confederate General John Bell Hood. He had been gravely wounded at Gettysburg on the afternoon of July the 2nd, and presumably spent the 4th of July in an ambulance wagon as Lee's army attempted to escape to the relative safety of Virginia. He would never use his left arm again. Undaunted, he recuperated in Richmond and returned to service on September 18, 1863, little more than 2 months after being wounded. 2 days later he lost his right leg just below the hip during the Battle of Chickamauga. On July 18, 1864, he was given command of the Confederate Army of Tennessee and the unenviable task of defending Atlanta against the Union forces of William T. Sherman. At the age of 33, he was the youngest army commander on either side of the conflict. His appointment was not without controversy. He was elevated above older, more experienced commanders. He had little experience in the art and science of commanding tens of thousands of men, something that even vexed Generals Lee and Jackson at the beginning of their association. One may also have questioned his physical fitness after suffering 2 major wounds in quick succession. In his defence, however, the one-legged warrior is said to have spent hours on horseback once he was strapped into his saddle. He did, however, hold 2 aces, his reputation for aggression and the favour of Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Living up to his reputation, Hood launched 4 major assaults against Sherman, incurring some 20,000 casualties, all without impeding Sherman's plans. On September 2, 1864, Hood ordered the evacuation of Atlanta and the destruction of any supplies that could not be removed. Having failed in direct assaults against Sherman, Hood resolved upon an indirect approach. Sherman was deep in a Confederate territory, with supply lines stretching back to Nashville, nearly 250 miles away. Attacking those supply lines, Hood reasoned, would force Sherman to fall back to protect his rear. He could then be destroyed at the same time and place chosen by Hood, who would then be free to march to the aid of General Lee in Virginia. Sherman pursued Hood briefly, then determined to live off the land, and turned east to begin his march to the sea. Hood declined to pursue Sherman, but planned a major offensive north through Tennessee. Hood hoped to defeat the Union forces there in detail, take Nashville, and carry the war into Kentucky, thereby forcing Grant to divert forces from his campaign against General Lee. It was, at best, a dubious strategy, requiring Hood to fight his way north into the deepening winter with a poorly supplied army and against a numerically superior, well-supplied enemy. Even had he liberated Nashville and destroyed the Union forces in Tennessee, he would have been hundreds of miles from Lee. Logic dictated that Hood continue to oppose Sherman rather than allowing him to cut a swathe through the fertile heart of the Confederacy. Perhaps, however, Hood had simply had his fill of fighting Sherman. Leaving Atlanta, Hood withdrew southwest to Palmetto, Georgia, where he rested and resupplied his troops for 3 weeks. There he was visited by Confederate President Jefferson Davis, and the attack on Nashville was agreed. Hood launched his offensive on November 21, 1864. Forced marches covered 70 miles in 3 days and threatened the forces of Union General John Schofield near Pulaski, Tennessee. Schofield reacted promptly and withdrew to Columbia, an important river crossing, and began constructing entrenchments. November 24th to the 29th saw the largely bloodless Battle of Columbia, as both sides consolidated their forces. On November 28th, General Thomas ordered Schofield to prepare to withdraw north to Franklin, where Thomas initially planned to meet Hood with the combined Union forces. In response, Schofield sent his baggage train and artillery 10 miles north to Spring Hill, keeping his infantry in Columbia to occupy Hood's forces. On the morning of November 29th, however, Hood sent 2 corps north to flank Schofield. By noon they had interposed themselves between Schofield's main force, now moving up from Columbia, and his artillery and baggage in Spring Hill. More importantly, Schofield's main force was now threatened from both north and south and ripe for envelopment. Hood failed to spring the trap. The Battle of Spring Hill, fought that afternoon and evening, was a desultory and largely bloodless affair. After night had fallen, Schofield's forces simply marched away into the night. By some accounts, Union troops passed just beyond the light of Confederate campfires. As dawn broke on November 30th, Schofield's troops were already building entrenchments in Franklin, while a furious General Hood ordered immediate pursuit. In 1864, Franklin, Tennessee, was a farm town nestled in a bend of the Harpeth River, roughly 20 miles south of Nashville. It had been the scene of a small battle in 1863, and Schofield's troops set to work extending and reinforcing the entrenchments from that previous engagement. By the time Hood's troops arrived on the afternoon of the 30th, Schofield's men had a strongly fortified line in a rough arc anchored at the Harpeth River on the northwest and southeast of town. Additional fire support came from artillery at Fort Granger across the Harpeth and just east of town. General Schofield spent most of the battle at Fort Granger, presuming that Hood would attempt to turn that flank rather than make a frontal assault on the Union entrenchments. After all, in many places the fortifications were some 4 to 6 feet tall, fronted with a ditch 2 to 3 feet wide and just as deep. Another trench behind the wall allowed Union soldiers to fire over or through the barricade as opportunities presented themselves. Finally, many of Schofield's men carried repeating rifles. In Schofield's mind, no reasonable commander would attack such a position. Hood chose the frontal assault. At roughly 4:30 in the afternoon, as darkness began to fall, he ordered 20,000 men across 2.5 miles to storm the Union position. Union veterans of the battle would later describe the oncoming Confederates as one of the most significant sights they had ever beheld. Thousands of men in serried ranks assembled, battle flags snapping in the evening breeze, bayonets burnished by the light of the setting sun, until they came within range, and first artillery, then rifled muskets, began to mow the men down. The first obstacle the Confederate wave encountered was 2 brigades of Wagner's division, which had reached Franklin late and had been stationed by General Wagner himself roughly a half-mile in front of the main Union line. Badly outnumbered, with both flanks bare, the Federals had 2 choices: surrender or run for their lives. Many ran, hotly pursued by Confederates eager to follow them into the works. Troopers on the main fortifications, unable to tell friend from foe in the gathering darkness, held their fire, and the Confederates punched through the Union centre, almost reaching the Carter House some 50 yards behind the main line, where Union General Cox had established his headquarters. The Carter family hid in the cellar, save for son Todd. He was mortally wounded on the grounds and would die days later in his childhood bedroom. The Confederate surge was met by Union reserves from immediately behind the lines. With rifle butts and bayonets, knives and fists and teeth, the Confederates were driven back and then over the barricade, exchanging pot shots and knife thrusts with the defenders, held in place by the next wave of Confederate troops and the knowledge that they would be easy targets if they broke cover. Some would remain trapped there, exposed to fire from both sides, until the battle ended. Similar carnage ruled the Union flanks. On their right, the Confederates were overextended and able to assemble only a single assault line. It made one assault, repulsed with heavy losses. On the Union left, a turn in Harpeth River had the effect of funneling the attacking forces into an ever smaller space, which reduced opportunity to manoeuvre and unit cohesion. To further complicate matters, the Union line here was fronted by an abatis of Osage orange, a particularly thick and resilient tree native to the area, and was covered by artillery fire from Fort Granger. Across the river, General Bedford Forrest did attempt to turn the Union flank, but his movement was discovered and intercepted by dismounted Union cavalry armed with Spencer repeaters. It was one of General Forrest's few losses during the war, and his first to a smaller force. Hood sent in his last wave at approximately 7 p.m, directly again at the Union centre. The unit commanders were unfamiliar with the ground, and General Cheatham, who commanded the first wave, advised that he had no officers left who could guide them. Once the Union position was located, however, the result was the same, repulsed with heavy losses. After this last assault, Hood attempted to regroup and plan fresh assaults for the next day. Schofield once again decamped in the night. His troops reached Nashville at noon the next day, with the remnants of Hood's army in pursuit. Some 10,000 killed and wounded were left behind to be cared for by the 700 residents of Franklin. Every house of any substance became a field hospital. The bodies of 5 Confederate generals lay side by side on the porch of Canton Plantation. Upstairs, in what had been the children's rooms, army surgeons hacked off shattered limbs, throwing the bits out of the bedroom windows. The floorboards still bear the bloodstains. Hood had taken Franklin, but the Union forces had escaped. Hood had taken Franklin at terrible cost. His army of 27,000 suffered more than 6,000 killed and wounded in just 5 hours of combat. More, the officer corps had been effectively decapitated. 55 regimental commanders were casualties. 1 general was captured, 7 wounded and 6 killed or mortally wounded. Patrick Cleburne, one of the generals killed, summarised the battle with remarkable prescience. "Well, Gavan, if we are to die, let us die like men." Would you like to write a script for us, just as Thomas did for this episode? Some of our most popular episodes have been written by listeners, so why not drop us a line at info@thehistorynetwork.org and make a suggestion for a script you'd like to write. We would love to hear about it from you. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Thomas Hall, read by Nick Barker.